The House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper.
Private members' business, consideration at report stage of Bill CS 226, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, Sergei Magnitsky Law, in the name of Mr. Bazan.
Comme il n'y a aucune motion à l'étape du rapport, la Chambre...
There being no motions at report stage, the House will now proceed without debate to the putting of the question on the motion to concur in the bill at report stage.
Seconded by Mr. Ziot, moves that Bill S-226, an act to provide for the taking of the restrictive measures in respect of foreign nationals responsible for gross violations of internationally recognized human rights and to make related amendments to the Special Economic Measures Act and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, as amended, be concurred in at the report stage. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion?
Yes.
All those in favour, please say... Whoops, sorry. I believe we have... Carried?
Carried.
Okay, very good, carried. When shall the bill be read a second time? Now. Now. Oh, sorry. Third time. My glasses are given out on me. Mr. Bazan, seconded by Mr. Ziot, moves that Bill S-226, an act to provide for the taking of restrictive measures in respect of foreign nationals responsible for gross violations of internationally recognized human rights and to make related amendments to the Special Economic Measures Act and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, be now read a third time and do pass. Debate. The Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's indeed a pleasure to rise to speak at third stage on Bill S-226. And I have to first of all thank Senator Raynell Andrechuk, who is the author of this bill over in the Senate, who has been advocating for this legislation along with a number of us for a number of years. And it goes back actually to Erwin Kotler, a former colleague of ours here in Parliament, who brought forward a motion back in 2015 calling on the Government of Canada to institute Sergei Magnitsky-style legislation, similar legislation that's been adopted around the world, and so we're continuing on in that vein. I made some amendments to the bill that he originally proposed, and Senator Andrechuk actually went even further to make sure that this bill is first and foremost focused on human rights violators, as well as corrupt foreign officials who are taking advantage of their citizens and abusing their positions of power. And we need to make sure that those individuals do not use Canada as a safe haven. One of the main pushes, of course, behind this is Bill Browder, who was put on red notice and wrote a novel about his experience dealing in Russia, and who had Sergei Magnitsky as his lawyer. And Sergei Magnitsky had uncovered the biggest tax fraud in Russian history. And for that, Sergei Magnitsky was falsely arrested and accused. He was imprisoned, he was tortured, and beaten to death in a Russian prison outside of Moscow. I also want to thank Marcus Kolga. Marcus has been an unwavering advocate for Sergei Magnitsky and having this type of legislation in Canada. He has worked across party lines to ensure that we get as close as possible to unanimous consent on supporting this bill. And I want to thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs for her support for Bill S-226 and for working with me and Senator Andrechuk and all parliamentarians to find a way that the government could also support this bill and the report stage amendments that we just concurred in really do strengthen the bill in a lot of ways and clarify the language so there's consistency between Bill S-226 and the Special Economic Measures Act. And I think all of us would be remiss if we didn't thank the huge diaspora in Canada, the Ukrainian diaspora, the pro-democracy Russians in Canada, the Vietnamese community, the Iranian community, the Falun Gong and Chinese community here, who really do believe that having this legislation in Canada, the Sergei Magnitsky Law, will enable the Government of Canada to hold those human rights abusers in their countries to account and ensure that they do not hide their money or bring their families and protect them here in Canada and not allow Canada to be used as a safe haven. So I thank all of them for their support, for their petitions, for their advocacy, for holding seminars and spreading the word about how important Bill S-226 is. So this is, as I said, it's about anti-corruption. It's about protecting human rights, projecting Canadian values, and it's really not just about sanctions and travel bans. It's about ensuring Canada cannot be used as a safe haven by those criminals. And by all accounts, as corrupt government officials, as human rights abusers, these individuals are criminals. And each and every one of them should actually be held to account in front of The Hague at the International Criminal Court. But until that happens, until the proper investigations take place, we have to ensure that Canada is doing our part in lockstep with the rest of the international community to ensure that we aren't being used to educate these criminals' children, to hide their families and their extramarital affairs here in Canada by buying homes and properties and hiding their families over here, or making use of our very strong banking system. And I know that if you look at some of the research that's been done, we've been already able to uncover, oligarchs from Russia who have hid money here in Canada and essentially used a shell game to clean their money and before taking it back to Russia. And, if you look at being a Russian oligarch who's been making use of their abuse of authority to enrich themselves, to commit tax fraud and other, devious schemes to garner money from the citizens of Russia or elsewhere for that matter, Mr. Speaker, that they would love to put their money in trusted banks like we have here in Canada, rather than being in Russian banks that are getting sanctioned often because of the Russians' aggression that we're seeing in Ukraine and Georgia and elsewhere, and are often getting sanctioned because of their support for Vladimir Putin's expansionist adventurism. Now, as I said earlier, there is other countries that have already passed Magnitsky-style legislation. The United States in 2012, and last year the United States actually made sure that the Sergei Magnitsky Law became a global Magnitsky Law. So it wasn't just about Russia, it's about other countries who are also human rights abusers, and people are getting rich by being human rights abusers, which is atrocious. We also know that European Parliament passed it in 2013, Estonia passed it in 2016, the United Kingdom passed it earlier this year, and Canada needs to get this done so that we fall in line. Now, all three main parties, as I said in the House before, in the last federal election, all supported Magnitsky-style legislation in the 2015 campaign. And so this is about the three main parties all coming together, supporting this legislation and bringing it into practicality and into reality. And people are going to probably saying, why do we need this? Aren't we already sanctioning Russian officials and Russian oligarchs and Ukrainian oligarchs who are responsible for the violence that we're seeing in Donbass, the illegal annexation and occupation of Crimea? We're already, sanctioning, this government and the previous Conservative government now, I think total is over 250 individuals and entities have been sanctioned and travel bans put in place. But that only applies to the situation in Donbass and Crimea. It doesn't talk to the broader context of all the different abuses that are taking place in Russia or any other country for that matter. And the way right now the Special Economic Measures Act works is that other international organizations have to direct Canada and member states to sanction because of a certain conflict or a certain issue, saying that we're now going to put in place travel bans and economic sanctions. So what we're doing is through Bill S-226 is putting another tool in the toolbox for the Government of Canada so that we can project our Canadian values and ensure that Canada isn't being used as a safe haven by those corrupt foreign officials and human rights abusers. So this will enable Canada to be able to go after other countries, other entities who are being human rights abusers. So it's not just about Russian aggression and the war in Ukraine. It's not just about Crimea's illegal annexation, but this is also about the torture of political prisoners in places like Iran. It's about the human rights abuses that we've seen in Vietnam. It's about the current genocide that's taking place in Myanmar with the Rohingyas. So, you know, this gives the authority to the government of Canada to act unilaterally in the interests of Canada to stop these types of human rights abuses, to send a signal that these type of corrupt officials will not be able to get away with it, that Canada is taking notice, and that us and our partners will ensure that we shut down their ability to launder their money, to hide their families, to ensure that they are enriching themselves by benefiting from Canada's strong financial institutions and strong assets that we have here through whether it's real estate property, whether it's businesses, whether it's investments. So this really is a great piece of legislation that enables it. Now, we talked about the changes, Mr. Speaker, that was brought forward by the government. And so there was a number of amendments, and a lot of it is dealing with language to ensure that it aligns between SEMA, the Special Economic Measures Act, and Bill S-26 to make sure that it's reliable and appropriate and evidence. We want to make sure that there's also fairness, and I accept the government's amendments to enable individuals that are put on the list of being sanctioned and travel bans. We want to make sure that they have the ability to say, okay, that you got me confused with somebody else. I have a right through a just process to appeal that. And so that wasn't available before under the legislation way it was drafted. So Senator Andrzejczyk and myself accepted that amendment. So it's also about making sure that the language from who is a foreign official, a public office holder, you know, other individuals, so that there is a way to determine it, and that is consistent between legislation within all the torts and legislation that we have. And we want to make sure that there is not just an open-ended list of indicators, but there has to be hard evidence of acts of significant corruption. And you know, it does still give the power to the Governor and Council to make the determination on who goes on the list, what sources of information are used, how do we compel different agencies and financial institutions and others to provide information, and making sure that it's valid. So, you know, the government did propose a lot of major changes that actually cleaned up the bill, provided more strength, more tools and mechanisms that we do support. Now, you know, we talk about some of the examples of where we are seeing human rights abuses outside of Russia. And I already mentioned what's happening in Myanmar with the genocide being committed by the Rohingyas. And, you know, if you look at that situation, there is individuals that are, you know, really responsible for it. So, you know, we should be going after the current military leadership in Myanmar. You know, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, Lieutenant General Sang Wen, who's the Minister of Defense, the Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Vice General Sao Win. You know, these are individuals who are carrying out a genocide, ethnic cleansing, and those individuals need to be held to account. Canada can act unilaterally and do that. Venezuela, you know, President Maduro and everything that's happening in Venezuela right now, they're clamping down on human rights, no freedom of the press. You know, we're talking about not only a recession and skyrocketing costs, inflation's, you know, impacting everything from food to medicine and medical supplies. But he's capturing his political dissidents. He's imprisoning them and torturing them. And so the Venezuela regime needs to be sanctioned. You know, this is all about, you know, making sure that all the political leaders and the military leaders, the police agencies down there are being held to account. You know, United Nations Human Rights right now says that just since April, 5,000 people have been detained, and thousands of those are still in custody. So Bill S-226 would be able to put in place the proper economic sanctions as well as travel bans to send a message to Maduro and his regime that this isn't warranted. You know, in Iran, President Rouhani continues to not just, you know, imprison his political dissidents, but he continues to execute them. And under Rouhani, and everybody thinks has got this charm offensive, political executions have increased 55% under him versus Ahmadinejad. This individual cannot be trusted. The Iranian regime must be held to account. And you know, he goes and imprisoning not just political prisoners, but ethnic and religious minorities, and continues to push out their theocracy and just impugn thousands of people all the time. And we can't forget that under Ayatollah Khomeini back in 1988, that 30,000 political prisoners were killed in one summer. You know, it was orchestrated and anticipated, and those individuals who are responsible still serve today in the current regime and have never been sanctioned. We can do that now with Bill S-226. But, you know, as we look at, you know, what's happening here and around the world, we can't forget about what still is happening in Ukraine, what is happening in Russia. You know, in Chechnya, we just saw the human rights violations of 200 men were rounded up and put in informal and unlawful detention centers based upon their sexual orientation. And those individuals belonging to the LGBTQ community had their rights violated, and at least 3 of them were killed. And so, you know, those Chechen leaders that are responsible for it, especially Ramzan Kadyrov, has to be held to account, and these individuals are no different than any of the other ones that we want to sanction. So I'll leave my final closing comments to the end of the debate today, Mr. Speaker, but I do want to thank all members of Parliament for their support, and I'm looking forward to seeing this go back to the Senate as quickly as possible.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know the member has been following the issue for a number of years, actually. And, you know, whether it's what's happened in Ukraine, something that gets a great deal of discussion inside the House, or, you know, just over the weekend, Dr. Nasir and others having this wonderful presentation at the Manitoba Legislature in regards to what's happening with the Rohingya. It is important for us to recognize that Canada does play a very important international role. And I always felt that wherever we can do things, that we should try to move forward, advocating for human rights. We are a party of the Charter of Rights. You know, Manitoba is the home province of the Canadian Human Rights Museum, as the member knows full well. So would the member not agree? You know, here we have a piece of legislation, and we'll see how the debate evolves, but just to, at the very least, recognize that, yes, Canada does have that strong leadership role that it can play, and that we should have that virtual unanimous support from the House, indicating that the best way to have influence is to bring solid proposals forward so that Canada can continue to demonstrate that badly needed international leadership on important issues such as this.
Good question.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Winnipeg North for his comment. And, you know, on the ledge, we also celebrated this summer the bringing home of more Yazidis into the community. Also, another ethnic group and religious minority that were persecuted by ISIS. You know, burnt on, trapped on Mount Sinjar. Many crucified on the cross. Many were burnt alive. And we see these horrific atrocities being committed. What we're witnessing right now with the Rohingyas. So Canada always talks the talk, but we always don't walk that talk. And this bill gives us the ability to do it. Canada has always been looked up to as a country that does stand up for human rights and tries to stand in the way of corrupt foreign officials. But too often we get caught in this issue of appeasement. And we saw that under the previous Minister of Foreign Affairs who tried to appease Vladimir Putin. We can't do that, and that's why it's important that the Minister of Foreign Affairs today is supporting this legislation, brought forward great amendments to it, and all members of the House should be able to support this bill to ensure that Canada has the tools to act unilaterally against those corrupt foreign officials who are committing these human rights abuses.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you, I'd like to thank the member, appreciate him spearheading this bill, and of course welcome the support of all the parties in the House. But, Mr. Speaker, it's one thing to enact a law. It's another thing to use the law. So I think it'll be really important for the Canadians who are watching to recognize that we do have pretty well all-party support to proceed with this bill, long overdue. But we also need to be watchdogging the government so they actually deliver on it. And of course, our party in the last Parliament was trying to get the previous Conservative government to bring stricter sanctions against Vladimir Yakunin and Igor Sechin. And now this government also are moving forward somewhat, but not completely. So would the member agree with me, through you, Mr. Speaker, that yes, we need to move forward and strengthen the law and strengthen the capacity of governments to act, but we also need the political will to act?
The honourable member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Edmonton for her comment. And I agree that you want to be able to add names to that list. And one of the things this legislation does is provide some parliamentary oversight, and the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House and of the Senate have the power to request names to be added to the Governor and Council. It also provides those individuals, if they don't feel they have or they shouldn't have been added to that list, there is an appeal process because of the changes and amendments that the government has made to this legislation. So there shouldn't be any reason to not put people on the list if there is that fair balance and the right of recourse given to those who have their names added to the list. So I appreciate that comment, and I know that the legislation will do just that, and provide, because of the parliamentary oversight that's provided, provides the political will to get it done.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's my honour to speak about Bill S-226, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Officials Act, the Sergei Magnitsky Law. First, I'd like to pay tribute to Sergei Magnitsky, who lost his life in a brave campaign to expose massive corruption at the highest levels in Russia. The circumstances surrounding Mr. Magnitsky's death have made it abundantly clear that state corruption and human rights violations go hand in glove. To protect their ill-gotten wealth, kleptocratic regimes dismantle rule of law and then the institutions of democracy. These regimes steal the people's wealth, then their rights, and in the end, their people's futures. Like Sergei Magnitsky, countless brave individuals across the globe have suffered violations of their fundamental human rights for speaking out. Like Mr. Magnitsky, many have been victimized by the very institutions and individuals entrusted with protecting them. Like Mr. Magnitsky, many have not seen the perpetrators brought to justice and instead have found themselves incarcerated, tortured on behalf of criminals by prosecutors and judges in show trials not to uphold justice, but to uphold the power of the corrupt. Many are eliminated, murdered, as was Mr. Magnitsky. Murdered to send a message to those foolhardy enough to take a stand on behalf of truth and justice. Human rights are integral to Canada's international engagements. We stand up for these inalienable rights, and we do not hesitate to speak out against human rights violators and abusers wherever they reside. Speaking out is important. However, words are not enough. That's why Canada needs to and intends to have a wide range of tools at our disposal to protect and to promote human rights. We will assess the circumstances and then choose the tools that have the best chance of getting the job done for the people directly affected and for the cause of advancing human rights globally. At the end of the 20th century, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, there were those who celebrated the end of history. Democracy, human rights, international rule of law was victorious. Clearly, the celebrating began too soon. Today, we find ourselves in a world where too often our shared Western principles of democracy, human rights, and rule of law are being flouted or undermined, not just by small dictatorial countries, but also by major powers. We seem to be entering into a world disorder in which there are those who believe they can disregard the human rights of their citizens, flaunt international law, treaties and agreements, or undermine the stability of their neighbors. It's not coincidental that the worst human rights violators, from Syria to North Korea, are also major threats to international peace and security. It's no surprise that a kleptocratic Russia, which killed Magnitsky, has militarily supported both of these states and militarily invaded and illegally annexed neighboring Ukraine's territory. This has important and dangerous consequences for all of us. Canada and our government has and must continue to engage constructively and deliberately. Let me briefly illustrate Canada's current human rights toolkit and then speak to how Bill S-226 will make an important contribution to Canada's ability to lead on human rights and anti-corruption efforts worldwide. First, no one should doubt that Canada and our government puts human rights on the agenda when we talk to other governments, at all levels, with officials to heads of state. These dialogues are not finger-wagging exercises. Canada raises concerns and does so forcefully when needed privately and publicly. But we also seize opportunities to learn from each other and work together to effect positive change. As the Prime Minister said in his speech at last week's UN General Assembly, we pursue human rights as a partnership through listening, learning, and working together as a way to build a better world. Second, Canada provides funding to multilateral regional and civil society organizations to protect and promote human rights. This includes the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the principal human rights-focused UN office. Third, we support human rights defenders. Recognizing their critical role, Global Affairs Canada has recently released the document, Voices at Risk, Canada's guidelines on supporting human rights defenders. This practical tool helps Canadian officials abroad to provide human rights defenders with the support that they need to be more effective advocates and to do so safely. Bill S-226 adds a new and important tool to this particular toolkit, the ability to take restrictive measures to sanction foreign nationals responsible for gross violations of human rights. To be effective, sanctions must be used wisely and selectively. During its review of the Special Economic Measures Act and the Freezing Assets of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development heard from some of the world's top experts on sanctions and the effective use of sanctions as a tool. As we heard in that testimony, sanctions are a policy instrument that can be useful in combination with other tools as part of an integrated political strategy. The role of sanctions as part of our engagement toolkit was evident recently when the Minister of Foreign Affairs announced sanctions against individuals in the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Doing so sent a clear message that anti-democratic behavior, the physical abuse and murder of protesting citizens, and incarceration of opposition leaders will have consequences. These sanctions are targeted against people responsible for the deterioration of democracy in Venezuela and are part of the multifaceted effort that the Government of Canada has been undertaking to pressure for a return to democracy. Bill S-226 would provide another tool to add to Canada's human rights toolbox by creating a new mechanism to respond to gross human rights violations as well as significant corruption in a foreign state by imposing sanctions on individuals responsible for these violations. The government proudly supports S-226, and we are confident that it will become a valuable addition to Canada's efforts to promote and protect human rights internationally. In closing, I would like to say a few words about the importance of the nonpartisan nature with which all members of the House have approached Bill S-226. On an issue as fundamental and as important to Canadians as the defense of human rights, it's uplifting to see that we can all work together. In particular, I'd like to thank our Foreign Affairs Minister, who so proactively engaged on this file, Senator Andrichuk from the other place, for her passion in bringing this legislation forward, the member for Selkirk-Interlake Eastman for all of his hard work, and the chair and members of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development for their diligence and perseverance, and their unanimous report, which provided invaluable guidance for this legislation. I'd also like to thank Marcus Kolga. Marcus, your facilitation and advocacy has been invaluable. Finally, to Magnitsky legislation champion Bill Browder, who I came to know during this process. Your relentless and principled efforts to honor the memory of your friend, Sergei Magnitsky, is enshrined in this legislation. To Natasha and Nikita, the wife and son of Sergei Magnitsky, your husband and father was by profession a skilled lawyer and principled auditor. However, within this lawyer and auditor resided a hero who would shine a light on the darkness of a corrupt regime. He sacrificed himself and his future for the future of the Russian people. Wieczna jemu pamięć. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise today to support S-226, also known as the Sergei Magnitsky Law, and the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act. The background to this important bill reads like a Jean Le Carre novel. A Russian lawyer uncovers corruption, theft, and tax fraud by a group of senior Russian bureaucrats and police. He reports it and suddenly finds himself arrested and imprisoned. Days before he has to be released, he mysteriously dies. A former business associate who had asked the lawyer to look into the corruption is himself expelled from Russia under threat of criminal charges. Years later, the U.S. agree on sanctions against the perpetrators of the corruption, only to find representatives of the Russian government, people with close ties to the corrupt officials, lobbying a U.S. presidential candidate to repeal the legislation. All of this happened, Mr. Speaker. The lawyer was named Sergei Magnitsky, and after he reported high-level corruption in 2008, he was thrown into a brutal prison where, according to many well-respected authorities, he was tortured for months until he died. According to the Washington Post, independent investigators found inhuman detention conditions, the isolation from his family, the lack of regular access to his lawyers, and the intentional refusal to provide adequate medical assistance resulted in the deliberate infliction of severe pain and suffering and ultimately his death. In 2012, the United States passed the Magnitsky Act, which named the individuals connected with the corruption and with Magnitsky's death and imposed financial and travel sanctions on them. And the European Parliament has passed a similar act, and both the United Kingdom and Ireland are also looking at new laws. In Canada, a resolution was adopted in 2010 that also imposed sanctions, much to the annoyance of Russian officials, one of whom, according to the Washington Post, called it none other than an attempt to pressure the investigators and interfere in the internal affairs of another nation state. I'm proud to say that the NDP has long been at the forefront of calling for targeted sanctions against those responsible for human rights violations. We have consistently called for Canada to coordinate our sanctions regime within the United States and the European Union, and to tighten sanctions to address major gaps. We believe individuals targeted by sanctions should also be inadmissible to Canada. Unlike the US and EU versions of the legislation, which targeted individuals connected with the case, the bill which is before us today is of a type known as a global Magnitsky Law, which is broader and is meant to be used to impose sanctions on any individual or officials from any country, not just Russia. And this is an important step in fighting government corruption worldwide. Last January, I had the opportunity to travel with the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs to Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Poland, and Latvia to cement our diplomatic friendship. On those visits, we continually heard from officials and NGOs about their concerns for ongoing Russian aggression and the need for continuing and even increasing sanctions against Russia. According to Paul Grod, National President of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, through its invasion of Ukraine, illegal imprisonment of Ukrainian citizens, and widespread and systematic abuse of human rights, the Russian regime continues to demonstrate its contempt for international law and democratic values. The adoption of Canada of Magnitsky legislation and the sanctioning of Russian officials responsible for human rights violations would be a strong signal that their actions are unacceptable to Canada. We call on Canada's members of Parliament to swiftly adopt Magnitsky legislation and the Government of Canada to enhance sanctions on the Russian Federation and ensure appropriate enforcement of the sanctions. I couldn't agree more, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to see that our legislation can be applied not only in Russia, but to corrupt officials anywhere in the world. Corruption is a global problem and a global threat. Transparency.org, which is dedicated to exposing and ending corruption worldwide, said, "The abuse of power, secret dealings, and bribery continue to ravage societies around the world." They go on to say, from children denied an education to elections decided by money, not votes, public sector corruption comes in many forms. Bribes and backroom deals don't just steal resources from the most vulnerable, they undermine justice and economic development and destroy public trust in leaders. Canada is a signatory to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument. It covers 5 main areas: preventive measures, criminalization and law enforcement, international cooperation, asset recovery, and technical assistance and information exchange. It includes bribery, trading in influence, abuse of functions, and various acts of corruption in the private sector, among its definitions. The Sergei Magnitsky Law we are discussing today dovetails perfectly with our international obligations under the UN Convention. It does more than commemorate a man who fought a corrupt regime and died for his work. It provides real sanctions against corrupt individuals. This bill includes the ability to freeze, seize, or sequester the Canadian assets and property of foreign nationals who have been deemed responsible or complicit in gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. Sergei Magnitsky began looking into the accounts of Russian officials at the request of an American-British financier, Bill Browder, who has taken on global corruption as a lifelong cause. And I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Browder last year in a lunch meeting here on Parliament Hill. He is now the head of the International Justice Campaign for Sergei Magnitsky. He wrote, "One of the questions I got at various different stages of my advocacy work in Ottawa about the Magnitsky Act was, what does this have to do with Canada? The fact that we found millions of dollars from the blood money of the Magnitsky crime coming to Canada makes Canada directly involved in this thing. This is not a hypothetical or an abstract notion. This is a situation in which a man was murdered for money, and some of that money came to Canada. I believe everyone in this House believes that Canada should not have any role in assisting government corruption abroad. This bill will ensure that Canada can no longer be an unwitting accessory to such acts, and it sends a strong message to corrupt officials everywhere. We are watching, we are paying attention, and we will not help you get away with it." Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Scarborough-Gilwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for getting that right. Mr. Speaker, prior to meeting Bill Browder, the name Sergei Magnitsky was just another name in the news. One more Russian dissident who's tortured or killed by Russian authorities when he or she got too close to the truth about Russian corruption. A long and sad list of people tortured or killed for standing up for the basic freedoms that we in Canada take for granted. Last year, Bill Browder asked to meet us, and he told us the Sergei Magnitsky story. and he gave us his book. I made a point of reading it. Briefly, Sergei Magnitsky had the opportunity to leave Russia. He believed, however, that the law would protect him when he exposed a massive $280 million fraud scandal involving some of the most powerful in Russia. There's a fine line between naivety and bravery, and some might argue that you have to know where the line is. He paid for that with his life. Very simply, Sergei Magnitsky died at the hands of Russian authorities because he exposed financial malfeasance at the highest levels in the Russian government. The second meeting was on the subject was with Vladimir Kara-Murza and the daughter of Boris Nemtsov, an assassinated Russian activist. Kara-Murza walks with a cane. He was poisoned by Russian authorities for being a Russian voice for democracy. Little did I know at the time that we would meet again, and he would be poisoned a second time. And only through an incredible set of circumstances is he alive today. There's no doubt that his bravery, superb intelligence, and persuasive testimony before the Foreign Affairs Committee brings us to where we are today. I took some satisfaction in contributing to the Foreign Affairs Committee report titled A Coherent and Effective Approach to Canada's Sanctions Regime, Sergei Magnitsky and Beyond. And I was particularly pleased with Recommendation 12, which says, in honor of Sergei Magnitsky, the Government of Canada should amend the Special Economic Measures Act to expand the scope under which sanctions can be enacted, including cases of gross human rights violations. Which leads me back to my first conversation with Bill Browder. What good will this sanctions regime do? The short answer is hit them where it hurts. The unique part of these sanctions can now be tailored and applied to those who torture and abuse human rights for financial gain, whether or not they can be linked directly or indirectly to any government of the day. Now there will be no place in Canada for gross abusers of human rights. No condos, no companies, no stocks, no banks, no access to banks or bonds or investments, nothing. Take your filthy money and keep it. I would have thought that every right-thinking person would support the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Minister's Initiative, and the bill before us. Therefore, it was with some surprise that I received the following letter from the Russian Congress of Canada dated June 15th and signed by Igor Babelich as president. It would be interesting to know, Mr. Speaker, whether the Russian embassy saw this letter before it was sent. I believe it would be instructive for members to see that letter and be quite willing to table it. In the meanwhile, however, I think I'll take my remaining few minutes to read from it. It's titled Statement of the Russian Congress of Canada regarding the announced adoption of the so-called Magnitsky Act, Bill S-226. The Russian Congress of Canada calls upon the Canadian government to withdraw its support for the proposed legislation, as it would set a dangerous precedent, further closing dialogue with Russia at this time. The Foreign Affairs Minister announced that she has agreed to endorse this version of the Magnitsky Act, which would punish officials allegedly involved in human rights violations, as it would provide for expanding sanctions. And that's true. It then goes on to criticize the member from Selkirk Interlake. Can't imagine why. And they give 3 reasons why this bill should not be supported. First, apparently because it mirrors the U.S. law and will not serve Canada's national interests or demonstrate Canada's leadership in the vital area of human rights protection. This copycat adoption of U.S. legislation under pressure from the most overzealous representatives of the Ukrainian nationalist diaspora will set a dangerous precedent and will further deteriorate dialogue with Russia at this time. That's the first reason. The second reason is the Foreign Affairs Committee heard only one side of the Magnitsky controversy. William Browder and a few longtime opponents of the Russian government who had little success in getting elected to public office. These members of the so-called Russian opposition in reality are fully marginal to the Russian political process and have very limited political support among the Russian population. Well, possibly, just possibly, Mr. Speaker, they have limited success in Russian elections because they are either tortured or killed. Possibly, if they stop being tortured, killed, or poisoned, they might have more success. The third reason is that the bill is named after the Russian Sergei Magnitsky. He was an accountant and has often incorrectly been identified as a lawyer. For some reason, that is very important to the writer, that he's been incorrectly identified as a lawyer. It goes on to say Magnitsky was arrested and put on a pre-trial detention facility. And after 11 months in detention, he died in November 2009. That's true. The official Russian investigation of Magnitsky's death did not find any evidence of maltreatment or torture. Wow. The reports of his beating by prison officials, which have been circulated in the West, have not been based on any empirical or documentary evidence. Well, maybe that has something to do with the fact that nobody can gain access to the evidence. And then, in a really interesting statement, he goes on to say, however, the Russian law has changed so that no criminal investigation can now be opened against those facing their first criminal accusation of tax evasion, and accused would not be detained during the processing of their case by the authorities. Somehow or another, that is not as comforting as possibly the writer would hope I would be. But I suppose it's an argument to say we are getting better. His fourth argument is even more interesting. He says the death of Sergei Magnitsky was unfortunate indeed. It certainly was. He then analogizes to the fact that in Canada, 43 prisoners died in 2014 and says that, well, prisoners die in your custody as well. As far as I know, Mr. Speaker, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I know, none of them have died while being tortured. We cannot support a bill that is ill-informed by individuals with personal animosities against Russia that drag Canada into a campaign of wholesale demonization of Canada's partners and neighbors in the Arctic, who also bear shared responsibility for the state of affairs of the region and must see each other as strategic partners but not enemies. And then goes on to urge that the government withdraw itself from its support of the Magnitsky legislation, as it would be detrimental to such a dialogue and counterproductive with regard to its announced purpose. I don't quite know, Mr. Speaker, what Mr. Babelich hoped to accomplish by his letter to parliamentarians, but it seems to me that it's exactly the opposite of what he intended to accomplish. I am very pleased, Mr. Speaker, to know that colleagues on both sides of the aisle, on all three parties, will unanimously support this bill. Thank you for your time and attention.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona. She may be limited. She may have about 7 minutes or so, 6-7 minutes, from what I can see on the clock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to stand as well, and if you could let me know when I'm close to 5 minutes, because we have very little time left, and I would like to give time to my colleague so that he can do his closing remarks. I know the bill is very important to him. Mr. Speaker, in my remarks, I don't want to repeat what everyone else said here. I too had the privilege of meeting with Bill Browder and to hear the story of Sergei Magnitsky. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind, and those who are following the proceedings, that this is about more than a couple of corrupt actors in Russia. There are reprehensible actions that occur around the globe, and the purpose of this legislation is to protect Canadians and to protect us from the receipt of corrupt dollars, and frankly, to prevent, any Canadians from interacting with and doing financial dealings with those who seriously violate human rights and those who are severely corrupt and may resort to torture. So I think it's important for us to recognize that we are giving some very clear, very sordid examples, and I stand by that, and it was a very sad tale. Sad to say that there are many such tales around the world, and it is long past time when we had the strength of legislation in this country so that our governments can move forward expeditiously when they want to take action to prevent this kind of sordid investment and to send a message to officials around the world and those who deal with officials around the world who may be involved in severe violations of human rights, torture, and severe corruption, money laundering. So this legislation will also prevent the money laundering coming from around the world. This is something that we can do, is one more stoppage to this kind of action around the world. It's kind of our act of protecting those in those other countries so that those officials can get away with the sordid actions that they do. So the purpose of this legislation is to extend and connect actions to prevent people from the right to immigrate to this country or to come here and to do business, as well as preventing them from investing the dollars, the profits from their sordid activities. Both are extremely important. It's important that people recognize that we'll be able to do twice as many things with this legislation. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to say that, as I mentioned to the honourable member who has tabled this bill in this place, that it will be equally important that the government act on this legislation. It's one thing to enact a law, it's another one to act, and I'm pleased to hear from the honourable member that there will be measures that will enable individuals to bring forward recommendations for further sanctions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to the closing speech.
The honourable member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleagues from Etobicoke Centre, Scarborough-Gilwood, Kootenay, Columbia, and Edmonton-Strathcona for their interventions tonight. It is important that we demonstrate that there is unanimous consent on this bill, that we are speaking with one voice against gross human rights violators, as well as those corrupt foreign officials who are abusing their power and authority to enrich themselves and their families. Now, and I also omitted thanking the hard work done by the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. That committee came out with the announced report on Sergei Magnitsky that really was a lot of hard work, an in-depth study, and provided great recommendations to the Government of Canada and to Parliament, and was there in a transparent manner for all Canadians to see. So I congratulate every member of the committee that worked on that report. Now, although we are talking specifically about human rights violators from around the world, we can't forget about those within Russia that continue to violate human rights every day. And just today, the opposition leader in Russia, Alexei Navalny, got for the third time another 20 days in jail because he was going to have a peaceful protest in St. Petersburg against the government, which also happens to be during Putin's birthday celebrations this weekend. So they wanted to make sure that he wasn't around to disturb the birthday celebrations for President Putin, and they threw him back in jail. And at his, arraignment this morning, he said about Putin's Russia, he says, all autocratic regimes come to an end. And I guess that's something that all of us, always consider. When we first started hearing about the corruption and Sergei Magnitsky's death and the people who are out promoting it, Boris Nemetsov, the previous leader of the Russian opposition, came here in 2012, and he described Sergei Magnitsky legislation as pro-Russian legislation. It's about standing up for the people of Russia. It's about standing up for human rights, for democracy, and the rule of law. And that's what we're doing today, is we're following through on Boris Nemetsov's best wishes that this would become reality. And of course, he was assassinated outside the Kremlin on February 27th, 2015. And so many of us also heard from Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is now the deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party and coordinator of the Open Russia movement. 2 attempts have been made on his life, assassination attempts by probably the Russian regime. But as he has said, and I think kind of highlights the difference between today's Russia versus the Soviet Union era, he says, for all the similarities between the Soviet era and present-day Russia, there is one major difference. While members of the Soviet Politburo were silencing dissent and persecuting opponents, they did not store their money, educate their children, or buy real estate in the West. Many of the current officials and Kremlin-connected oligarchs do. And it is for that very reason that Russia is being used as a catalyst for the Sergei Magnitsky Law. They're the ones that murdered, tortured Sergei Magnitsky, and we've all paid tribute to him tonight. But we can't forget that they continue to abuse their positions of authority, the kleptocracy that surrounds Vladimir Putin, the oligarchs that support him. And that type of corruption and human rights abuses has infiltrated into regimes around the world, as we're talking about Venezuela, about Iran, about Myanmar, and what's happening in Vietnam, and what's happening against the Falun Gong in China. We need to take that role and stand up against that type of atrocities, that type of violations of human rights, and we cannot allow them to use Canada as a safe haven. I appreciate everyone's support for this, and I'm looking forward to getting this back to the Senate as quickly as possible.
La question est la suivante. Monsieur.
The question is as follows. Mr. Bazan, seconded by Mr. Diot, moves that Bill S-226, an act to provide for the taking of restricted measures in respect of foreign nationals responsible for gross violations of internationally recognized human rights, and to make amendments to the Special Economic Measures Act and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act be now read a third time and do pass.
Pleasure of the House to adopt the motion. All those in favor, please say yay. Yay. All those opposed, please say nay. In my opinion, the yeas have it. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the recorded division stands deferred until Wednesday, October 4th, 2017, immediately before the time provided for private members' business.